a space for us.
Un espacio para nosotras.
Un espace pour nous.
Hello and welcome to the Forest Storytelling Initiative, a space for us, where we amplify the voices of activists and civil society organizations around the world. This month, we bring you our annual March With Us campaign, a celebration of the stories and visions of activists and gender minorities worldwide. This year, our focus is on reimagining powers. I am your host, Clarisse, and in today's episode, we are more than honored to be joined by Frank Mugisha, a Ugandan LGBTQ advocate, Executive Director of Sexual Minorities Uganda, abbreviated SMOG, a 2014 Nobel Peace Prize nominee, and one of Time magazine's 100 most influential voices of the year 2024. Thank you so much, Frank, for honoring our invitation today.
Thank you very much for having me and sending greetings from Kampala, Uganda.
Let's begin with our interview and with your journey as an advocate for LGBTQI plus rights in Uganda. Can you tell us how your activism began and what motivated you to take on this role?
Thank you very much for having me. My journey as an activist dates way back, I think, from my entire adulthood life, since becoming a teenager, really. Because I started speaking out in my own home to any kind of injustice towards me, especially around my sexuality, and I wasn't silent about it. And so that sort of gave me a foundation to have my own voice and not allow any kind of discrimination. And so when I was at university, in my first year of university, together with my friends, we started supporting young LGBTQ persons, especially who needed support in scholastic materials, livelihood in terms of relief, providing them with those who needed food and basic needs. And so out of that, I decided then to start a support group that was supporting mainly young gay men who were coming out of the closet. Because at that point in life, I felt that was the biggest issue that many young LGBTQ Ugandans face, the fear of being exposed, the fear of coming out to their own families and friends. So I started a support group that allowed people a space where they can talk to each other. And genuinely, many of my friends that I knew were not out, though they were out to me, and my other friends were not out to their families. And many of my other friends that I interacted with, the only conversations they had were never around sexuality and gender identity. They were only heteronormative. And so for some people, they found these spaces that are only heteronormative toxic, but also they couldn't express themselves freely. So I decided to have this space that allowed anyone to be who they are. And that is what started my journey as an advocate for LGBTQ human rights. Because then within this group, I started advocating for coming out, providing people with information on how I came out to my own family and my own friends, supporting people who are out with a shoulder or speaking to them. And then, of course, it's a spectrum and it's a broad range of issues that come out when you're interacting with individuals. It's not going only to be limited to coming out. There are other issues that are going to come up. Then we started seeing this hatred from the media, and I couldn't stay silent about it. I had to speak out about it. I started writing on blogs and, writing, any kind of opportunity I had, I would write about how I feel about all this hatred I'm seeing from religious leaders and politicians in Uganda. And I started encouraging people. I started talking to people about sexual health. So it became a broad range of issues. And then at some point, it became a center for everyone coming to me for information, and not only for information, but even for people who wanted to meet partners, matchmaking. They're like, "Do you know someone? Have you met someone I can?" I was like, "Oh, this is too much for me now." But that is sort of how I found myself into activism or advocacy. Something I never decided on myself, but it was just a gradual process. And it was sort of like a calling where you find yourself in that space.
Thank you so much for explaining all of that. The Sexual Minorities Uganda, I mentioned it earlier, abbreviated SMUG, has become a point of reference and support for the LGBTQI plus community in Uganda, especially in a context where they continue to face discrimination and violence. Can you tell us more about the organization, its mission, and the impact it has had over the years?
Thank you. So Sexual Minorities Uganda was founded in 2004. And when Sexual Minorities Uganda was founded, I wasn't there. I wasn't in the founding. In fact, at that moment in time, I was still at university. But a few years passed, maybe a year or a year and a half. And then colleagues who were at Sexual Minorities Uganda reached out to me because then I was known in Uganda as someone who is supporting community members with coming out with a social support group. And so I started teaming up with Sexual Minorities Uganda. But let's go back into the founding of Sexual Minorities Uganda. So at a point, the influence of American Christian evangelicals started growing in Uganda in the early 2000s. And so some of the good strategies that Uganda, my country, Uganda, had on fighting HIV and AIDS were being interrupted by some of the Christians who felt like groups like the LGBTQ community should not be included in national HIV and AIDS response and strategies. And so some of the people were concerned about that. Because of this concern, they started reaching out to individuals who are either openly LGBTQ or who are supporting communities, sort of come and have some kind of organizing and push back and ask the government to include LGBT community members in national HIV and AIDS responses. At that point, some of my colleagues who were here at SMUG were brought into a room, and then Sexual Minorities Uganda was founded. And immediately at its founding, Sexual Minorities Uganda faced a lot of criticism from government and law enforcement. In fact, one of our founding members, who is a transgender man now living in the United States of America due to hostility he faced in Uganda, his house was raided by the police, and a guest he had at home was arrested and detained and subjected to a lot of inhuman and cruel treatment when in police custody. So we sued the government for that, and that is how I really so much got involved in Sexual Minorities Uganda. And I think that was after 2 years of founding of SMUG. And I got so much involved in this case. I was at court every day. I was working with the lawyers. And in 2008, when I was already leading SMUG, we won this case. And so prior to that, we also had a campaign in the media where we felt we've been discriminated so much. And after listening to stories that were even worse than the stories I had heard before, or to what I had been exposed to, discrimination of LGBTQ persons, I was very sad, touched by many of the stories I heard. And so we decided as a community that we should simply go out in the media and ask Ugandans to let us live in peace and let everyone live with everyone, despite of their sexuality or gender identity. So we had a media campaign in 2007, which was called Let Us Live in Peace. And majority of my colleagues wore masks on their faces. They covered their faces with masks. Part of this was, of course, to protect their identity from the danger that comes with being on the media and being LGBTQ. But part of it, the message was to Ugandans that anyone can really be behind this mask. It could be your dad, your uncle, your brother, your sister, your son, your daughter. It could be anyone. It could really be your best friend, someone you love, because they don't tell you who they are because of how society has treated the LGBT community. But anyone can be behind this mask. So we thought that this simple message of empathy and love and asking for simple things as tolerance, not even acceptance, will be received properly by the Ugandan society, and we'll start to see changes. But unfortunately, we received the worst backlash ever. There were massive demonstrations around the country calling for our execution, calling for LGBTQ persons to be put on an island until they all die, calling for arrests, calling for many of our friends who worked with us, who are working in the media or who supported us in civil society. Some of them lost their jobs. Some of the experts that supported us in any way were deported. So it was a big backlash. And at that moment in time, I was already in the transition to the leadership of the LGBTQ community and sexual minorities in Uganda. And so that is the moment I started appearing so much in the media, television, and in our local media, because the campaign went on for 45 days. So in a nutshell, that is when SMAG started creating its visibility, and it became so visible and became an international household name, because then we started seeing the international community feeling sorry for us, because majority understood this is a very small population of people, young people at that, who are trying to find their voice and their place in society, and they're being discriminated. And you have massive religious leaders, politicians going after them. So we started seeing the empathy, the support coming in from the international community. The international media was very, very supportive in amplifying our voices and following the violations that are happening. Then we started seeing international governments, international bodies like the United Nations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, coming in and saying, look, this is violations of human rights. This is persecution. This is prosecution. And so there was interest in what is happening in Uganda. And so our advocacy was really shaped in that way of visibility and resilience, because we try to create as much active campaigns as possible. Because at that point in life, after we had this campaign where we wanted to live in peace and harmony with every Ugandan, and that was not accepted, we realized that the only solution we have for our safety and protection is our visibility. So we decided to keep it up, staying in the media, staying very active, having active campaigns, and making sure that we safeguard our community as well.
Uganda's Constitutional Court upheld most provisions of the 2023 Anti-Homosexuality Act last year, including the death penalty in certain cases. This has been described as a ruling that enshrines hate and discrimination. How has this law impacted the LGBTQI plus community in Uganda, and what are you and SMOG doing to respond?
Yes. So when the Anti-Homosexuality Act was reintroduced, because remember we had the Anti-Homosexuality Act that was called Kill the Gays Bill in 2009. We fought it, but when it was repealed on a technicality, because then the courts said that when the law was being passed, there were not enough members of parliament. So this law was reintroduced in 2023. And in what is very unprecedented is this law moved very fast in our parliament. In fact, the fastest law that has ever gone through our parliament. And within a very short period of time, went to courts, activists, civil society, lawyers, some members of our own parliament, and even some people from the government. We have one of the Ugandan ambassador to South Africa who is challenging this legislation. And so the Constitutional Court removed some provisions. For instance, they removed the provision that would deny housing to LGBTQ persons. They removed the provision that would request mandatory reporting for any person who is perceived or known to be LGBTQ person. And then they removed the provision that limits access to health. But then they left the death penalty. And then they left promotion of homosexuality, which would criminalize all the advocacy that we do. And by the way, prior to passing of the law, there was so much propaganda, mis and disinformation that led to the shutting down of my organization. Right now, we are operating underground because we were shut down by the government. So going back to the law, went to court and those provisions were removed, and the action has been too much. Number one, we have documented so many cases of violations. Just within 6 months of passing of the law, we documented over 700 cases of discrimination. Within 9 months of passing the law, we documented over 1,060 cases of violations. And these violations include people who have been evicted from their homes, people who have been beaten when they're just going on with their day-to-day lives, people who have been denied services at health facilities, people who have been arrested because of their sexuality, sexual orientation, or gender identity, people who have been denied jobs and housing, people who have been thrown out of their homes by their own families, lesbian women who have been sexually abused by their own family members or people they know, young people who have attempted suicide because of trauma and mental health because of the existence of this legislation. So the impact of this law has been too much on the LGBTQ community, and it is still ongoing. But we've done so much advocacy, both nationally, internationally, and regionally. There is no single person who has influence on this country, Uganda, that I have not engaged with or met with, or sexual minorities Uganda has not engaged with. We have tried to get in all the voices that can help us have dialogue, have conversations. There's been so much behind the scene diplomatic interventions and bilateral talks with Uganda and international governments on this legislation. There have been a lot of businesses and multinational corporations or multilateral corporations that have spoken to my government saying this law is bad for business. There have been letters written. There have been solidarity messaging from all around the world that have been written to my president saying this law is not necessary. You are discriminating your own citizens for nothing. There have been demonstrations outside our embassies and consulates and high commissions all around the world. There have been solidarity groups that have marched in the streets in different countries in support of our advocacy and activism in Uganda, calling for this law to be repealed. There have been scholars that have written books, have written journals and papers saying this law should be removed. The media has amplified our voice. The international media has covered the LGBTQ community to a very large extent, showing Uganda that we will keep the attention on Uganda. International leaders have spoken out. So there's been so much advocacy and attention on the legislation. And right now we are in the Supreme Court. I am very, very optimistic, and I believe that our challenge in the Supreme Court is very solid. We've put up very strong arguments why this law is unnecessary. And it is my belief that at this point, our Supreme Court judges headed by our Chief Justice, will do the right thing and entirely repeal the legislation.
Thank you so much for explaining all of that. And one of the major challenges you've mentioned is the harmful narrative that homosexuality is a Western import, in quotes. How do you address this myth and combat the misinformation fueling homophobia in Uganda?
I mean, combating misinformation and disinformation is very difficult. And it is one of the most hurtful and painful issues that we have to deal with as advocates. I personally, in 2022, I faced so much stigma and so much misinformation and disinformation to the extent that I almost fled Uganda because the stigma, because of this misinformation and disinformation from social media, was too much, and it put my life at extreme risk and danger. I received so many death threats, and I received a lot of threats, not only on my phone or social media, but physically from people and at my home. And since then, I've not stabilized in one permanent home. I keep moving homes because until now, the ripple effects are still there. So countering this misinformation and disinformation has been very difficult. But some of the strategies we've used is to provide as much, first of all, not to counter misinformation and disinformation immediately it comes out, because then you create a debate that we can't easily prevail on, because majority of Ugandans are not supportive of our work. So what we've done is rather opt for going into providing information on our own media or through people who provide accurate information, allies and partners. And after the situation has sort of calmed down, and also trying to lobby and advocate within the mainstream media and change their thinking and narratives. So for instance, ever since 2022, when I was facing these challenges and my organization, I decided to start writing blogs in our mainstream newspapers. Unfortunately, they accepted. And so I was able to provide a version of the truth. And so that in a way limited some of the harassment from law enforcement and the state who were believing the misinformation and disinformation. But we also try to run on our own social media. We try to educate the public on the misinformation and disinformation that is spread, and mostly really by extreme American evangelicals, or they are paying for it, because we know that most of that is being paid for by extreme American evangelicals. And also exposing the misinformation, the money that is pouring in to pay for this misinformation. Unfortunately, there has been some respected media houses like Open Democracy that have exposed some of these sponsors of hatred, of misinformation and disinformation on the LGBT community.
Your work has gained international recognition, but the fight for LGBTQI plus rights in Uganda remains an uphill battle. How can the international community and individuals support SMOC and the broader movement for equality in Uganda?
Thank you very much. It is very important to support communities that are in places that are not very much known around the world, because these communities that are silent, they are struggling so much and they need our support and solidarity. And it is very important to identify individual advocates and human rights groups and small organizations like mine. I mean, we are known internationally, but we are a very small organization and a very small community that still needs a lot of support. International solidarity is very important. when you speak up and use your voice, support and speak for the LGBT community, there are many people who feel that they have been represented. There are many people who can't speak. There are many people who can't stand up for themselves. In our own communities, there are many people who cannot come out to their families, to their friends, when they see a voice out there speaking out for them. They feel represented. They feel seen. They feel they belong somewhere. So use your voice in any fora that you can find and speak up for the LGBTQ plus community. But most importantly, identify any small local organization in your community, abroad, or anywhere, and talk to them. Ask them, how can I help you? How can I be in solidarity with you and support them? And continue to sign petitions online. Continue to let your voice heard on social media. Give a voice to the media that supports local groups. It is very important. But most importantly, ask your own leaders in your own societies to support the LGBTQ community. We still need international solidarity. As I mentioned, for us in Uganda, international solidarity is our security and safety. So once we have that support, it helps us continue our work. And for every person who is feeling alone, I think the community is very strong. We support each other. And for our allies and partners, let us make this a global solidarity. We are seeing transgender rights being attacked around the world right now, including in the United States. We are seeing the weaponization of LGBT human rights in Uganda, weaponization of trans rights in the United States and other places. This should be a global movement. Homophobia is not only an African problem, but it's a global issue. And finally, it should be a cross-cutting movement to our partners, because right now we are seeing the same people who are promoting homophobia and transphobia, the same people who are promoting the anti-gay laws in Uganda are doing the same in Ghana, Kenya, Malawi, Tanzania, Russia, most parts of Eastern Europe. These are the same people promoting hatred around the world. They are not only promoting hatred, but they are not only promoting hatred around LGBTQ human rights, but women's rights. They're undermining the progress we've made on women's rights and gender equality. This should be a cross-cutting movement. So we should, as a movement, make this a cross-cutting movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time. It was an honor having you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to you, our listeners, for tuning in to A Space for Us for this edition of the March With Us campaign, which focuses on reimagining powers. Remember, your voice matters. Let's continue to march together for equality, for justice, and for love. And until you hear from me again, take care of yourselves and empower someone next to you.
A space for us.
Un espacio para nosotras.
Un espace pour nous.